Welcome to the second panel of this wonderful conference. My name is Anna Lanoszka. I'm a professor here in the Department of Political Science, and I'm very happy to chair this fascinating panel called The Economics of the Apocalypse. We have 3 papers, 4 presenters, and the first presenter is Professor John Palmer, who joins us here from the University of Western Ontario with the presentation called Property Rights and Contracts in the Post-Zombie Apocalypse World. If you can take it away, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. If you'll excuse me, I can't do 2 things at the same time, and that means sitting down and talking at the same time, so I'm going to have to sort of wander around and cruise around a bit. When I first agreed to do this presentation, I didn't know a lot about zombies, but I have read apocalypse novels. Since then, I've, of course, read novels and watched films. The one novel that I really want to recommend to everyone is Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. It's one of the funniest novels I've ever read in my life. Can't stand Jane Austen in Pride and Prejudice, but that novel is absolutely hilarious. So I recommend it. I also read World War Z, and I think I preferred the book. Those of you who were here last night know that I preferred the book to the movie. Okay, on to the talk. The usual apocalyptic conditions. They're panic, because people have limited information. There's a huge risk out there. They don't even know what the risk is. They're uncertain about what's coming. They know they have to search for protection, they have to search for safety, and eventually they'll know they're going to have to search for food and shelter. And in the movie last night, we saw they have to search for drugs as well in certain places. But what kinds of people are prepared for these things? We had a talk earlier this morning about survivalists, people who prepare for eventualities. Some people prepare consciously, some people prefer less specifically. We don't know what's coming, we just like to save. And there's some religious groups that believe that you should save just in case. In economics jargon, we call the savers people with a low rate of time preference, or we refer to them as the risk averse. Some people also save for the possibility of apocalyptic conditions. They're profit seekers. Some of you who don't like the idea of profits might refer to them as price gougers, but they send the proper signals about what's efficient and what isn't efficient. At the same time, we see in every apocalyptic situation that legal structures tend to deteriorate. The reason, again, in terms of economics jargon, is that expected benefits and the expected costs of committing crimes change. The expected benefits of engaging in crime increase dramatically in comparison with the expected costs. As Professor Bright said last night with the title of his speech, those rules don't apply anymore, right? So as a result, we see hoarding. Now, I'm not so sure that hoarding is such a bad thing in general. We see theft, we see murder, and the etc. refers to things like rape and cannibalism. But what about the post-zombie apocalypse? Well, every movie, every novel that I've read about or seen suggests that the results will be fairly similar. One possibility is a partial zombie victory. The zombies terrorize us or colonize us. In some instances, people have talked about the rest of us non-zombies, I refer to them as the rounds, as being almost colonized by the zombies. Maybe a bit like The Walking Dead, maybe a bit like much of World War Z, but not really. I'm not going to read that last thing. It could be a standoff. But the problem is that zombies in the standard traditional zombie, I'm not talking about the ones where the zombies actually evolve, but the standard traditional approach, the zombies have no leaders, there's no way to negotiate with them, but there can be a standoff in a sense that they keep coming and keep attacking, but the rounds hold their own. But that's difficult to imagine because eventually, as we saw with World War Z, either in the novel or in the movie, the rounds develop techniques for defeating the zombies. And so we're not going to see that this fragile peace will be an infinite peace. It can't persist over time. But it is the type of scenario that we see in The Walking Dead or the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. So what about the rounds? And that's what my presentation, I think, is supposed to focus on, more about what happens with the rest of us non-zombies after the apocalypse. Well, they have to organize defense. And that requires armaments, it requires human resources, and because if you want to learn economics, I can give you 4 words that teach you all you need to know about economics, okay? People respond to incentives. That's all you need to know for economics, okay? Go in there, write that on any exam. If you're taking an economics course, just write, people respond to incentives. How do we organize the armaments? How do we organize the human resources? Whether we want to admit it or not, people respond to incentives, they respond to the rewards, they respond to favoritism, whatever it might be. I spoke with someone who was an anthropologist working with some pretty primitive tribes, I guess we could say, in the Amazon jungle. And he said, yeah, people respond to incentives. They respond, and there's favoritism within the tribes. Okay. What about the rounds? Well, they have to organize defense, but they also have to organize communications with other communities or with other pockets of humanity. Many of the apocalyptic stories and scenarios involve people being isolated in different communities. How do we communicate with the people in the other communities? Oftentimes, there's no electricity. Oftentimes, there's no internet. Many of the situations that have evolved in some of the novels and the movies involve shortwave radio, where people use solar power or wind power to fire up the shortwave radios and communicate that way. But it has to be organized somehow. And we have to encourage the production of goods and services. It has to work out somehow. Why? Well, because as Professor Bright told us last night, and as we all know, inventories run down eventually. We can go to the stores and get all of the canned goods and all of the freezer goods we want and all the dried meat. Eventually we run out. So we have to somehow figure out new sources of supply. Well, there are two basic things, and Professor Bright talked about these. You sort of took half of my talk last night. Marauding and scavenging, or production. Either way, scarce resources must be allocated to the various uses. If you organize a group of people who are going to go around and maraud and scavenge and take things from other people, you still have to organize it somehow. You have to have scarce resources that have to be allocated to these different activities within the marauding or within production. And that's what economists call the economic problem, scarcity. It's very difficult and very inefficient to organize output if you don't have some division of labor and some specialization, even within a household. And in order to have that, you have to have some trade, either within the community, within a group, or maybe formalized. Okay? Maybe as a sharing culture. The trade doesn't have to be legalistic, let's sit down with our lawyers and draw up contracts. Most of the trade we experience in our day-to-day lives is trade that takes place in an informal way. But the important realization is that efficient trade involves well-defined property rights, or more generally legal entitlements of some sort, and enforceable contracts. Again, that doesn't mean we have to have lawyers writing up the contracts. It could be some sort of informal cultural thing where we develop a relationship between each other, but there must be within that informal relationship some sense that if you cheat on your agreement, that there will be some way to enforce the agreement, some way to seek, if not retribution, then some compensation of some sort. Okay, a very crucial addendum here is that there's an importance of avoiding regime uncertainty. This is a term that economists like to use. If there is such a thing as regime uncertainty, that means that we don't know what rules we can count on. Can I count on trusting you next time? Can I count on the rules put down by the dictator being in place tomorrow? If I take some time to grow some wheat today under one set of rules, will that set of rules apply again tomorrow or next year? if we don't know what the rules are, we're not going to plan very far ahead. If we don't think those rules are going to be stable, we're not going to plan very far ahead. So somehow, property rights must be created or recreated so that trade can occur. Those property rights don't have to be legal. They can be the godfather making decisions. And if the godfather is in a powerful position, a long-term maintained position, there will be very little regime uncertainty. People will know what they can count on. People will be able to plan ahead, given those rules. It could be something like a king in a fiefdom. It could be a democracy. It doesn't have to necessarily be a democracy. In fact, with a democracy, we see that sometimes the rules get changed, whether we want them or not. But it's only when we have those property rights well defined that people begin to think about producing for the future. So we come to what I think is probably one of the hearts of understanding all of this, what I'm trying to say, and that is that when these legal entitlements are clear and are known to be well enforced, if we expect that they will be well enforced. It's not just that they're known to be well enforced. If we expect them to be well enforced, if the transaction and negotiation costs are low, in other words, if we have mechanisms, again, they can be informal through a community garden even, then we know that resources are going to move to their more highly valued use. That is my restatement of something known as the Coase theorem, which is named for the very famous economist who won the Nobel Prize, Professor Theorem. Okay, so how are the property rights created and how are they enforced? By the way, I did these slides about 2 or 3 days ago. And what do we have here? Professor Bright's trust and reputation. Okay? That's one way that we create and enforce property rights and legal entitlements. But they're not enough. We have to have a dispute resolution mechanism. What if people start cheating on how much land they're allowed in the community garden? What if people start shirking? And that's what we often have to deal with. How do we enforce the contracts? And we have to have some kind of force in order to enforce the contracts. Like it or not. Let's not live in a Pollyanna world. It's not going to be a Pollyanna world after the zombie apocalypse. There are going to be marauders. There are going to be thieves. We've seen it with every apocalyptic novel there is. So how do we do it? Well, the other 3 words you have to learn to be a good economist, it all depends. We're good at that sort of thing. But what we know is that you have to do it well if you want to have a culture and a society that's going to survive. The pockets of civilization that do it well are going to be more likely to thrive. I say they will thrive. Okay, everything I'm talking about is in probabilistic terms, of course. Those that don't do it, well, they're going to be taken over by the zombies. They're going to be so wrapped up in their infighting that the zombies will take them over. Or they'll be taken over by other marauding groups that are better marauders than they are, or better farmers than they are, better machine producers than they are, whatever it is. The need to do it well means we need to have force, but it's not a sufficient condition for doing it well. Because demagogues and tyrants can create regime uncertainty. A lot of it. Just take a look at Venezuela, for example, which makes property rights and contract rights far from certain. And if they're far from certain, that means we're not going to have economic growth, and that means that everyone, the rich and the poor alike, are going to be a lot worse off and less likely to be able to fight off the marauders from other communities. So it doesn't necessarily have to be democracy. If I'd had a chance to rearrange the slides, this one would have gone a lot earlier, sorry. An eventuality. I don't know how long this will take after the zombie apocalypse. After any apocalypse, it takes a long time for people to suddenly begin to take over. And that's basically what happens, that some people have to take over somehow to create new constitutions. If the constitutions meet with popular support, then they're going to be likely to last. If they don't meet with popular support, we're going to be more likely to see civil war, lack of trust within the community. Speaking of trust, if I were answering that question, what do you mean by trust? The question that was posed yesterday, I would say something about having Bayesian priors that deal with expectations of not being deceived in the final play of a repeated play prisoner's dilemma game or something along that line. But that's, again, a lot of jargon, statistical jargon. In the very long run, you need popular support. And all the possibilities, and this is the point, involve granting or taking control of the use of force. Who's going to use the force? To create and enforce legal entitlements. Thank you very much.